When we think of exile today, we might picture a political writer sent away from their country, or maybe a fallen leader living out their days in a foreign villa. It's a serious thing, but it feels manageable. You can get on a plane, you can call home, you are still a person with rights, just in a different place. Medieval exile wasn't like that. It was something deeper and much more terrifying. To understand it, you have to understand the medieval world itself. It was a world built on belonging. Everything about your life, your identity, was tied to a specific place and a specific community. You were John from the village of Oakhaven. You were a subject of the Duke of Normandy. You were a parishioner at St. Jude's Church. Your name, your work, your safety, your very soul were all rooted in these connections. Exile severed those roots, all of them. It wasn't just about being told to leave. It's about being erased from the community that defined you. It was a kind of social death. And in a world without police forces, social safety nets, or even reliable maps, it was often a prelude to a very real one. There wasn't just one kind of exile. The word covered a few different punishments, and they varied in how bad they were. The simplest form was banishment. This was a formal order to leave a certain territory. A town council could banish a troublemaker from the town walls. A lord could banish a knight from his lands. A king could banish a powerful noble from the entire kingdom. If you were banished, you had to leave, but you were still, in theory, a subject. You still had your name and your basic status as a person. The problem was, you just couldn't be here. You had to go there, and wherever there was, you were a stranger with no connections and no protection. But there was a much worse form of exile. It was called outlawry. This was a whole other level of punishment. An outlaw wasn't just banished. They were declared to be outside the protection of the law itself. Their property was taken by the crown or their lord. Their family might be punished too. And worst of all, their life was forfeit. Anyone could kill an outlaw without facing any legal penalty. In fact, sometimes there was a bounty for it. In Old English law, an outlaw was called a wolfshephode or a wolf's head. This meant they were no longer considered human in the eyes of the law. They were a beast to be hunted down. They had no rights, no home, no name. They were forced to live in the woods, the swamps, the wild places of the world. They survived by stealing and hiding. The legend of Robin Hood is a romanticized story of an outlaw, but the reality for most was a short, brutal, and lonely existence. To be declared an outlaw was essentially a death sentence, just one carried out by the whole of society instead of a single executioner. Then there was the spiritual version of exile excommunication. This was the church's ultimate weapon. If you were excommunicated, you were cast out of the community of God, you couldn't attend Mass. You couldn't receive the sacraments, like communion or last rites. This was terrifying for a deeply religious person. It meant your soul was in peril. But it also had huge social consequences. Christians were forbidden from associating with an excommunicated person. They couldn't give you food, shelter, or work. They couldn't even speak to you. Your friends would shun you. Your family might be forced to turn you away. A king who was excommunicated could find his subjects turning against him, believing their oaths to him were no longer valid. These forms of exile could overlap. A rebellious baron might be outlawed by the king and excommunicated by the pope. His life, his property, and his soul were all declared forfeit. He had nowhere to go, either in this world or the next. So medieval exile wasn't a trip, it wasn't a change of scenery, it was the complete removal of a person from their world. It stripped you of your land, your title, your wealth, your friends, your family, your legal rights, and sometimes even your connection to God. It made you a non-person, and it cast you out into a world that was suspicious and hostile to strangers. The punishment wasn't just leaving home, it was losing everything that made you who you were. So how did someone end up in this terrible situation? It wasn't random. Exile was a formal part of the medieval legal system. It was a tool used by kings, lords, towns, and the church to maintain order, punish enemies, and solve problems that couldn't be fixed with a fine or a few days in the stocks. The reasons for being exiled were as varied as medieval society itself. At the highest level, it was all about politics and power. A king might banish a powerful duke who was getting too popular or who he suspected of plotting against him. Exile was a cleaner solution than execution. Killing a high-ranking noble could start a civil war. Their family and allies would want revenge, but sending them away removed the threat without making them a martyr. The exiled noble was out of sight and out of power, left to wander in a foreign court while the king consolidated his own position back home. History is full of these stories. A brother banished by a king, a queen sent away in disgrace, a powerful advisor who fell out of favor. It was a key move in the Great Game of Thrones, but exile wasn't just for the rich and famous. It was a common punishment for serious crimes among ordinary people. If you committed murder or another felony, you might be sentenced to exile. Sometimes, it was a way for a community to deal with a person they simply couldn't handle. A village might have a violent drunk who constantly started fights and caused trouble. After enough warnings, the village court or the local lord might simply banish him. Go be a problem somewhere else. It was a way of exporting your problems. There was also a peculiar legal process in England called abjuration of the realm. It worked like this. Imagine a criminal, say a thief who just killed a man in a robbery, is on the run. He knows he'll be hanged if he's caught. His only hope is to run to the nearest church. Under the law of sanctuary, he couldn't be arrested as long as he was inside. He was safe for a while. But he couldn't stay there forever. The coroner would be called. The criminal would have to confess his crime. He would then be given a choice. He could leave sanctuary to stand trial, which almost certainly meant execution. Or he could abjure the realm. This meant he swore an oath to leave England forever. He would be branded and stripped to his underclothes. He would be given a wooden cross to carry and told to walk to the nearest port. He had to walk every day, without straying from the king's highway. When he got to the port, he had to take the first available ship to another country. If he was ever found in England again, he could be killed on sight. It was a formal, ritualized process for becoming an exile. It saved your life, but it cost you your home. The decision to exile someone was made by different authorities. A king's court could outlaw a traitor. A manorial court, run by a lord, could banish a peasant from his estate. A city's council could vote to expel a merchant who cheated his customers. And of course, the church had its own courts. A bishop or the pope could excommunicate someone for heresy, blasphemy, or defying the church's authority. The process itself could be very formal, with a trial and a written sentence. Or it could be much simpler. A powerful lord could simply tell someone to get off his land and never come back. If you defied him, his men at arms would enforce the decision. There was no appeal. For most people, the law was what the most powerful person in the room said it was. The length of the exile could also vary. Sometimes it was for a set number of years. You are banished for 7 years. More often, especially for serious crimes, it was for life. You are never to return. The finality of that sentence, in a world where most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, is hard to imagine. It wasn't just a punishment. It was the end of your life as you knew it. The law didn't just tell you to leave. It legally and socially unmade you. The sentence was passed. The words were spoken. You are banished. You are an outlaw. What happened next? The reality of leaving was a brutal shock. It was the beginning of a journey into the unknown, a journey that most were completely unprepared for. The first step was the departure. It was almost always a hurried and humiliating affair. You had no time to pack or prepare. You couldn't sell your property to raise money for the road. If you were an outlaw, your land and goods were seized anyway. You left with nothing but the clothes you were wearing and whatever you could carry in your hands. Family goodbyes were brief and agonizing. Your wife and children were left behind to face the shame and poverty that came with your sentence. Your friends turned away, afraid to be associated with you. In a single day, your entire world collapsed. Then came the road. We have a romantic image of traveling in the past, of walking through green forests and rolling hills. The reality was different. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks. They were poorly marked and incredibly dangerous. There was no police force patrolling the highways. The woods were home to bandits and desperate men just like the newly exiled, who would kill you for your shoes. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every approaching footstep could mean robbery or murder. An exile had no one to vouch for them. They had no lord to appeal to for justice. If they were robbed or beaten, there was no one to turn to. If they were killed and left in a ditch, no one would come looking for them. They were utterly alone and vulnerable. Survival became a daily struggle for the most basic things: food, water, and shelter. You couldn't just walk into a town and buy a meal. You had no money. You might try to beg, but people were deeply suspicious of strangers. Every village was a closed community, and outsiders were viewed with fear. They might be criminals, carriers of disease, or just another mouth to feed. You would be met with hostile stares and told to move on, so you ate what you could find. Berries from a bush, a fish you could catch in a stream, an animal you could trap. Or you stole. A loaf of bread from a baker's stall, a chicken from a farmyard. This, of course, was incredibly risky. If you were caught stealing in a foreign land, the punishment would be swift and severe. Mutilation or hanging were common. Finding shelter was just as hard. Inns were for paying customers. You couldn't afford a room. You might sleep in a barn if a farmer took pity on you, but that was rare. More often, you slept in the open. In a ditch, under a tree, in a cave, you were exposed to the rain, the cold, the snow. Sickness was a constant threat. A simple fever or infection, something easily treated today, could be a death sentence for an exile on the road. And through it all, there was the immense psychological weight of what you had lost. Every step took you further from your home, from everyone and everything you had ever known. The loneliness must have been crushing. The fear was constant. The despair was a heavy cloak you could never take off. Your past was gone, and your future was a terrifying blank. You were no longer a person with a place in the world. You were just a ghost, walking a road to nowhere. For a noble, the journey might be slightly easier. They might have a horse, a purse of gold, and a servant or two. But even they were vulnerable, a tempting target for robbers. For a commoner, the journey was a desperate scramble for survival, one that many did not win. If an exile survived the journey, they faced a new challenge. What now? Where do you go when you can't go home? How do you build a new life from nothing in a world that doesn't want you? The experience of life in exile was vastly different depending on who you were. For the common person, a peasant, or a craftsman, life was bleak. You would likely drift towards a large town or a city. These were places where a stranger might be able to disappear into a crowd, but disappearing didn't mean you were welcome. And cities were wary of newcomers. They had their own poor to deal with, guilds which controlled all skilled labor, or closed organizations. You couldn't just show up and become a carpenter or a stonemason. The guilds protected their own members. You, a foreigner with no connections and no one to speak for you, stood no chance. So most exiled commoners ended up on the absolute fringes of society. They joined the swelling ranks of beggars, pleading for scraps outside church doors. They might find occasional work as a day laborer, doing the hardest and dirtiest jobs for a pittance. Some were forced into a life of crime, joining gangs of thieves in the city's slums. Others might try to find a place as a mercenary, selling their sword to a lord who didn't ask too many questions about their past. It was a hand-to-mouth existence filled with uncertainty and danger. Language was another huge barrier. While the educated elite across Europe might share a common language like Latin or French, the common people spoke a vast number of different dialects. An exiled farmer from England would be completely lost in a German town. He couldn't understand anyone, and no one could understand him. This isolated him even further, marking him instantly as an outsider to be watched and distrusted. For a powerful noble, the experience was entirely different. An exiled duke or earl wouldn't be begging on the street. They would make their way to the court of a foreign king. These high-status exiles were valuable political assets. A king might welcome a banished English baron to his court in France. Why? Because that baron was an enemy of the English king. He could provide valuable intelligence about his home country. He could be used as a political pawn, a threat to be held over the head of his rival. Support my policies, the French king might imply to the English king, or I might just fund an army for your exiled enemy to come back and claim your throne. So these noble exiles lived in a kind of gilded cage. They were given fine clothes, rooms in the palace, and a seat at the king's table. They spent their days plotting, scheming, and sending secret letters back home, trying to engineer their return. They were surrounded by the comforts of courtly life, but they were still exiles. They had no real power of their own. They were entirely dependent on the goodwill of their host, a goodwill that could be withdrawn at any moment if they ceased to be useful. Their life was one of constant anxiety and political maneuvering. There were a few places an exile might find some small measure of peace. Monasteries, scattered across the landscape, were sworn to uphold the Christian duty of charity. A desperate exile might find a meal and a safe place to sleep for a night, but this was only a temporary solution. The monasteries couldn't support them forever. Sanctuary, as mentioned before, was a legal protection tied to the church. But it was usually a temporary state before abjuring the realm. You couldn't live in a church forever. Ultimately, life in exile was a life of suspension. You were caught between a past you could not reclaim and a future you could not build. Whether you were a beggar shivering in an alleyway or a lord scheming in a foreign court, you were defined by what you had lost. You were a stranger in a strange land, and the single, burning hope that kept you going was the thought that one day, somehow, you might be able to go home. Was exile always a permanent state? Was there ever a way back? For some, yes, but the road home was often as difficult and dangerous as the road they had traveled into exile. A return was never guaranteed, and it depended almost entirely on luck, politics, and power. The simplest way to end an exile was to be forgiven. A king or lord who had banished you might issue a pardon. This rarely happened out of pure kindness. It was usually a calculated political move. Perhaps the exiled noble's family had successfully pleaded his case and offered a huge sum of money. Or maybe the king needed that noble's military skill for an upcoming war. Forgiveness was a tool. The king would pardon the exile in exchange for future loyalty and service. The exile, desperate to return, would have little choice but to agree to whatever terms were offered. A much more common path to return was a change in power. The king who banished you might die. His son, the new king, might have been a friend of yours, or he might simply hate his father's old advisors. To consolidate his own power, the new king would often reverse many of his predecessors' decisions. He would recall his own allies from exile and banish his father's favorites in their place. The wheel of fortune was always turning. One man's rise was another man's fall, and for an exile, the death of an enemy was the best news they could possibly receive. A letter would arrive at the foreign court. The old king is dead. You may come home. This was the moment every exiled noble dreamed of, but waiting for your enemy to die could take a long time. For the more impatient or ambitious exiles, there was a third option: returning by force. This was the ultimate gamble. An exiled lord might spend years in a foreign court, carefully building alliances and gathering support. He would persuade his host king to lend him money, ships, and soldiers. Then he would launch an invasion of his homeland, hoping to rally disgruntled nobles to his cause and overthrow the man who had exiled him. This was how many of England's kings came to the throne. Henry Bolingbroke, banished by King Richard II, returned from exile with a small army, claimed he was only there to get his rightful lands back, and ended up deposing Richard and becoming King Henry IV. Edward IV came back from exile to defeat the Lancastrians in the Wars of the Roses. This path was a high-stakes roll of the dice. If you succeeded, you won everything: your lands, your titles, and perhaps even the crown itself. If you failed, you and all your followers would be hunted down and brutally executed as traitors. Even if an exile managed to return legally, it wasn't always a happy ending. The world they had left behind had moved on. Years may have passed. Their home might have been granted to a new family, one loyal to the king. Getting it back would involve a long and expensive legal battle. Their wife may have died or remarried. Their children, who were young when they left, might now be adults who barely remembered them. The friends they once counted on may have shifted their allegiances. The return home could be a bitter and disillusioning experience. The home you remembered so fondly in your dreams no longer existed, and for the vast majority of exiles, the common people, there was no road home. There were no political games to be played, no armies to be raised. They had no power and no influence. Their banishment was a life sentence. They died in foreign lands, their names forgotten, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. They found new lives out of necessity, perhaps marrying a local and raising a family that had no connection to their old home. They assimilated and disappeared, their story ending quietly in a place far from where it began. Exile was a fundamental part of the medieval world system of justice and politics. It was a weapon, a sentence, and a state of being. It was far more than a physical removal. It was a profound and brutal act of unmaking, of severing a person from the very fabric of their world. For a few, it was a temporary setback in a larger game of power. But for most, it was a one-way journey into oblivion.